Debunking Russian myths about NATO. Russian supporters to this day still believe that NATO was the cause and reason for Russia to invade Ukraine. They also believe that because of NATO, the unprovoked attack was completely justified and Putin totally didn't do anything wrong. So the next time you see a Russian bot repeating Kremlin talking points about how evil NATO is, then be sure to send them this video, because I'm about to debunk the most common lies about NATO in regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. Myth number 1. NATO is encircling Russia. For the people that say NATO is encircling Russia so Putin's war was justified against Ukraine, here, take a look on the map where NATO actually is. Does that look like encirclement to you? Send this video to all the people who support Russia who can't take 5 seconds and Google it on a map. Russia is a massive country with a huge military, and it's hard to believe that Moscow genuinely fears their encirclement. To its east, Russia has allies in Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China to varying extents. These countries make up the majority of Russia's land borders. The border with Ukraine is comparatively the size of a flea. Even if Ukraine had joined NATO, that would hardly make a dent in the overall portion of Russia's border that it shares with allies, rather than adversaries. It is obscene that the country with the most landmass in the world, bordered by an ally with the most people in the world, China, can claim to be encircled. Get a world map up and have an honest look at who the allies are and who the adversaries are. Russia's paranoia has to be absolutely through the roof if they genuinely believe that they have been backed into a corner. The so-called corner that they talk about is bigger than Europe itself. For some reason, it seems that every corner you turn on the internet, there are some genuinely stupid people who believe it's not Russia's fault that they were forced to invade a neighboring country by NATO. Myth number 2. NATO promised Russia it would not move eastward. The story is always told in Russia that supposedly NATO promised it would never expand an inch to the east after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I too like to indulge myself in the occasional fairy tale, but at least I know the difference between BS and reality. Can Russian supporters point out the treaty or agreement or any piece of evidence that this was something agreed upon between Russia and NATO? Who signed it? Who was it between, and what were the terms? You can't find it? Because it doesn't exist. All diplomatic agreements are solidified by tons of documentation in modern-day history. And if such an important agreement did occur, but there was nothing written down and signed on paper, then guess what? It's probably because it never happened. No country has been forced into joining NATO, and Russia doesn't get an eternal say over what independent Eastern Europe states decide to do with their foreign policy. The situation that Russia essentially wants is to be able to determine the foreign policy of other countries, or else it feels it has the right to invade. To most sane people not living in a mental asylum, this isn't a sustainable agreement. And when we get down to it, Ukraine has never been in NATO, with membership still looking several years off before the beginning of the war. So when you unfold the myth for what it really is, little old Putin decided to invade a neighboring country because Ukraine, a separate country, didn't create foreign policy in the way he wanted. It is one thing for the Russian government to keep an eye on geopolitics and engage in diplomacy to shape things as they want. But it's the behavior of a tantrum-throwing child to turn violent every time someone does things their own way. If we follow Russia's mad line of thinking, then Moscow isn't at blame at all for being put in a paranoia-inducing situation. Over the last century, Russia has had an often hostile relationship with its neighbors, to say the least. From Ukraine to Finland to Poland to Chechnya, Moscow has made a habit from the Second World War to today of sending its armies into places where it's not wanted. It is crazy that the Kremlin can pretend to act shocked when its neighbors who got their independence 30 years ago show signs of wariness. Myth number 3. NATO is not needed in Europe because Russia is peaceful. It is not just history books alone which show Russia has a habit of putting itself in precarious and tense situations. For the entirety of Putin's leadership in the modern day, the country has shown itself as happy to prod and poke where it's not wanted. Russia spends a far larger portion of its GDP on its military than most other European states. It recently showed in Kazakhstan that it will happily send those forces to support governments it considers allies, even if it's against the population's wider, obvious wishes. It's no surprise that Eastern Europe has noticed Russia has a habit of throwing its army around to dislodge the governments it doesn't like and support the ones that do its bidding. Whilst no one can argue with the fact that NATO membership has enlarged, Russia never seems to want to ask why so many Eastern European countries are keen to sign up. There are strings attached to being a NATO member, and countries like Finland and Sweden and Ukraine aren't interested in membership just for the sake of it. Signing up to NATO normally means more pressure to invest in one's military, as well as losing some autonomy for foreign policy. For a sovereign state to voluntarily sign up for things like this, they must have something to be wary of. Have no doubt, a huge portion of that wariness is the erratic Russian government, which seems to be getting more and more of a taste for blood. If Russia was so against countries joining NATO, then maybe they should perhaps, stop invading other countries. If you're raping and pillaging all of your neighbors, why do you have a surprised Pikachu face when those same neighbors decide to join up and create a self-defense force? Ukraine will now be wishing that they found their way into the North Alliance Treaty Organization many years ago, so that would have saved them from the invasion that has now come storming through the door. So it is not necessarily a myth that NATO has increased in membership, but it is a myth that Russia isn't partially responsible for that expansion. Myth number 4. NATO is responsible for causing Putin's invasion. Although it is true that NATO forces have been involved in training Ukrainian soldiers, much of the Ukrainian army indeed gets access to NATO equipment and expertise, but that is not the same thing as NATO troops lining up on the Russian border. Every country has a right to train and equip its military as it sees fit. Russia wants people to believe that the right thing for Ukraine to do was to just abandon its army, lay down, and let Putin do whatever it wanted to without a fight. But it's easy to predict what would have happened instantly if Ukraine took such an approach. Kiev would fall in a matter of days. Think about it. If Russia has been so enthusiastic about invading Ukraine, even with their NATO support, imagine how much sooner they would have attacked Ukraine without NATO assistance. By Russia's rhetoric, it's a lose-lose situation for Ukraine. Either they learn to defend themselves with the help of NATO intelligence and equipment and get invaded for being provocative, or they give up any hope of having a strong military and watch Russia march right in and violate them. Myth number 5. The Russian invasion is self-defense against NATO. Kremlin propaganda wants you to believe that this is all just about Russia defending its borders from alleged NATO aggression. Except there's just one problem. Literally, no one has ever attempted to stop Russia from doing just that. NATO never did anything like that. Neither forces from Ukraine nor NATO ever touched the Russian border before the invasion. Russia's policy stops being one of defense and becomes a policy of offense as soon as they march unwelcome across the border. If Russia was genuinely interested in defending its borders, no one would have a problem with that. Myth number 6. NATO sanctions do not affect Russia at all. The last myth to debunk is the idea that economic sanctions have no impact on stopping the war. Some people think that the military and the economy are completely separate, and so there's no point in sanctioning Russia to defend Ukraine. When thinking about it, this point is clearly stupid and makes no logical reasoning whatsoever. If you believe in this, then you are clearly a child and have never paid bills in your life. Moscow is only able to continue the war because of the widespread internal support for Putin and his expansionism. However, support is going to wane thin if Russian people see their living standards drop too dramatically for too long. There's only so much patience that the average Russian can display for a crushed economy, and if they start turning on Putin, then he will have to turn his focus back home rather than to Ukraine. This is what makes sanctions such an effective tool in potentially stopping the Ukraine war. Putting pressure on the economy completely shifts the political situation in Russia, not to mention the fact that most modern-day weapons of war require technological components from overseas, which Russian sanctions can no longer access. Sanctions destroy the ability of Russia to wage this war, unless they want to be attacking Ukraine with weapons that would be relevant 200 years ago. Then they can't continue this fight for long. For supporters of Ukraine, the Russian political landscape needs to be shifted as much as possible until a group less obsessed with aggression gets a chance in Moscow. Sanctions help to make that outcome more and more likely every day. Remember, Russia's war is fought in the mind as much as it is on the battlefield. The Kremlin relies on enough people thinking what it wants people to think for the invasion to continue. Myth number 7. Russia blames NATO to distract from domestic problems. Now, there's no dispute that Russia has domestic troubles, but the invasion of Ukraine is hardly a healthy distraction. It sucks more and more Russian resources, of which there are so few. It's hardly a clever distraction for Putin to tell the Russian people that their electricity has to be cut short because their tax money is going towards buying bulletproof vests that turn out to be literal cardboard for the troops. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a distraction, but more an exacerbation of domestic troubles. It only serves to make the economy drastically worse and inevitably upsets its citizens in the long term. Even if Russia is successful, they are hardly going to reap huge financial benefits from any occupation. They will be in charge of a country turned to rubble and be under sanctions bigger than most seen in history. It is a myth that these military exploits are a distraction and should instead be accepted for what they are: genuine, expansionist ambitions of a country that has consistently throughout its history tried to enlarge buffer zones around key areas. These moves are not distractions, but a direct way of achieving the Russian leader's goals. This is not a distraction from domestic troubles, but something that is being strived for that negatively impacts the domestic situation. Calling it an attempt to distract alleviates the military responsibility of the Kremlin in this situation. There have been many more myths about the politics surrounding the war, and there will be many more to come. But the foundation of a conflict like this is inevitably military, and the rhetoric will continue to focus on this area for as long as shots are being fired. Everyone involved wants to make it seem like they are winning so that they can encourage further support and reinforce optimism. It's always important to be careful that what you're hearing is not just propaganda, but is actually based on truth.